What do the former CEO of Ford Corporation that turned around Ford in the midst of the Great Recession of 2008 and the co-founder of Costco share in common? They are both leaders who have demonstrated positive humility in their leadership style, in the way that they've run their businesses. My guest today is Marilyn Gist. She is the author of The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility. And as an author, speaker, and educator, Marilyn held the Boeing-endowed professorship of business management at the University of Washington. Later, as the associate dean at Seattle University, she started the Center for Leadership Formation and led the EMBA degree from its inception to rank number 11 in the nation by the U.S. News and World Report. Dr. Gist and I have a deep conversation about the power of humility, how humility is demonstrated in practical ways, and what you can do to recover or build humility in your leadership style, and how that can have a tremendous positive impact upon people in your organization. Enjoy my conversation here today with Marilyn. I think you'll find some deep insights that'll be extremely helpful to you in your leadership. And thank you for listening and watching Construction Genius. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Marilyn, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you, Eric. It's a delight to be here.
One of my favorite places to shop is Costco. And you have a very interesting story about your encounter with the co-founder of Costco, Jim Sinegal. Can you tell our audience about that, please?
Sure. Jim is an amazing person. I had taken over a new job and was looking for a speaker on short notice. And we had some people in the program I was working with who'd come from Costco. So I thought, well, maybe I'll invite this guy. And I figured he's too busy, but it's worth a shot. Dialed the number and it rang, and I'm waiting for his assistant to answer. And all of a sudden it picks up and there's this brusque voice that goes, Sinegal. And I was just floored. What CEO of a multinational company answers his own telephone? I mean, Costco's everywhere, right?
All right.
So I said, well, you don't know who I am. I'm sort of nervously explaining what I need, and I'm expecting he's going to say he can't do this. And he, again, is still kind of brusque, and he goes, well, what date is it? Well, I'm going to need to check my calendar. What's your name again? And what's your phone number? Okay, I'll check and get back with you. And he hung up the phone, and I'm still sort of nervous, and I just figured, well, he's going to pass me off to his assistant, who's going to call back and regret that he's not available. Right. So I'm starting to think of who else I can call. And about 15 minutes later, the phone rings, and I picked it up. Marilyn, this is Jim Sinegal. That date looks okay. What time was it again? And where do you want me? Okay, I'll be there. Can you send me an email? Give me a little more information, but I'll be there. And again, I hung up the phone, and I just thought, wow, this man didn't even know who I was. And he personally called me back, Eric. That was just amazing that he did that. Now, I have to say, he heard me tell that story another time, and he said, well, Marilyn, I don't always answer my own phone, but if I'm sitting there and I'm free, I do.
Interesting. You've just published a new book called The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility. In your mind, why is what Jim did, how did he demonstrate the kind of humility that you're talking about in your book?
Oh, that's a great question. A couple of ways. One is that it was a personal touch. And I get it that people have assistants when they're in a big job because it helps them get more work done, to have somebody take some of that load. But this was a personal touch. And even if he only does it some of the time, even if he does it once or twice a month, stories like that carry, right? Because people are so impressed that he took the time. It showed to me that he had a balanced ego. He didn't have to call me back. He could have He could have passed that task off to his assistant, but he took the time, which said to me he was shrinking the power distance between us rather than expanding it. He wasn't standing on his status and his power. He saw me as a human being and treated me as a human being who was worth his time. It honored my dignity in a way that really went above and beyond what he had to do.
You had a phrase there that caught my attention: shrinking the power distance. And you're speaking of that in terms of a demonstration of humility. First, give us a concise definition of what you mean by humility. And then I'd like to talk about that idea of shrinking the power distance.
Sure. So I define it as a tendency to feel and display a deep regard for others' dignity. Dignity meaning self-worth. And we all have and need a sense of self-worth, Eric, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when a leader is interacting with us, they have more power than we do generally.
Right.
And so we can't always speak up and defend ourselves, protect ourselves. We're somewhat vulnerable, and we have to rely on them to respect our dignity, our sense of self-worth. When leaders sort of stand on all the power and status they have, I mean, we might not mind that if they treat us okay in other ways, but some leaders with a balanced ego don't feel they need the status and power in order to work together with you. You know who the boss is. They don't have to, wear the title on a badge or stress it all of the time. And so when they step outside of that power, they don't give it up, but they basically treat you as another human being, almost as if you're on the same level. So they're shrinking it. And that's what Jim did by returning my phone call himself. He put us on more of the same level. And you don't forget that when a leader, especially a very powerful leader, does that.
This idea of shrinking the power distance, give me a little bit more about what you mean by that and why it's so important.
Well, there are a number of things that can demonstrate humility, but again, if humility is showing regard for others' self-worth, others' dignity, by shrinking that power distance, by coming down to the level of, first of all, the integrity. When he said he was checking his calendar, I mean, I didn't know if that was what he was really doing. I could have been handed off. Someone calls me back, says he can't do it. You never know. That happens all the time. But the fact that he called me back personally and said he could do it showed me he had integrity.
Right.
It also showed me he had a balanced ego. He was not above making a personal call himself.
Right.
He basically just treated me as a human being, as if I were a member of his organization, almost a favorite member of his organization. So he closed the distance between us in terms of status and standing, and it made me feel seen. I felt valued as a human being.
I think sometimes a leader is either overly conscious of the effect that he or she has on others and leverages that negatively, or sometimes they're clueless about the impact they have as they walk in the room. In your experience, how do you see leaders functioning with that power that they innately have?
Most of them, in my experience, are clueless. They move into a leadership role by a lot of hard work, and they just feel as if they are just who they are, and they're not aware. I joke about it. It's like you have a big P on your forehead that everybody sees but you. The P for power.
Wow.
Because you're the boss, and so you walk in the room and there's this big P. And so most of them are not aware of it. And what happens is people move into leadership roles, they almost need to dial back on some of the display of that power, because it can be intimidating to other people. And particularly because you can't know everything. You need people who are willing to tell you where some of the problems are, let you know if you're making a mistake. I mean, healthy organizations, healthy leaders want that information from people. And if they keep too much power distance, then people are reluctant to speak up and let them know about that. So by shrinking that distance a little bit, it doesn't mean you don't have high standards,
right?
But it does mean you respect others' dignity. And so people feel more comfortable speaking up and letting you know what's going on.
Excellent. Now, I know a lot of construction companies that I work with, they're in the midst of transitions where you have men and women who are, in their late 50s and 60s, and they're transitioning the business to newer generations of leadership. And therefore, there's new leaders coming into roles they haven't been in before. With that idea of people not being conscious of the amount of power that they have in a leadership role, what advice would you be giving to a CEO in terms of how they're mentoring their new leaders about how they show up when they take on a new position of leadership?
Have in your mind what needs to be done from a task or a job standpoint, but the way you need to deal with people needs to begin with humility so that you build those relationships. You build that trust. You want people to feel that you're going to care for them. And I'm not talking about, wanting them to bring all their personal problems to work.
Right.
But, in a normal interactive way, that you're not going to stomp all over them. So I think particularly when someone's coming into a new leadership role, there's a risk that they can feel somewhat insecure. And so they step into the job in a big way. I want everybody to know that I'm strong, that I'm going to be the boss, that I'm going to take charge and everything's going to be okay. But because they often aren't aware of how much more power they now have, they can intimidate in a negative way and cause people to start being mistrustful or fearful, so that it ends up hurting the leader because they don't get the information. They don't build collaborative, trustful culture.
So let's say you have been promoted. How can you begin to show that humility in a proactive way?
So let me just dial it back a minute and say, when I think of my definition of humility, it kind of sits midway between meekness,
right,
which you don't want as a leader. You don't want that lack of confidence and that weakness.
Yes.
So humility takes confidence. It takes a certain strength, not just to set the standards, but to be able to dial back your power and still stand with people knowing that you're the boss.
Right.
You have this power, but you don't have to show it all the time. At the other extreme is arrogance, this tendency to be very boastful, to not take responsibility, to blame other people, to stand as high on the power throne as you can.
Right.
So humility is really in the sweet spot between those two, where you're confident, but you are very, very mindful of other people's sense of self-worth and very respectful of it. In my book, there are a number of really specific behaviors that I talk about that leaders can demonstrate. So I frame it through this lens of, when people are coming into contact with a leader for the first time, there are really three things that they have in mind. It's, who are you? Not just your name, but who are you as a person, right? Where are we going? And do you see me? So I talked about Jim Sinegal doing something that made me feel seen. Do you see me? And leaders answer those questions through the things they say and the things they do. So, you take something like, when I talk about who are you, it's like, who am I as a person? Do I have an excessive ego? Am I arrogant? Am I dishonest, or do I have integrity? Can you trust me? Those are the two biggest things people care about. And then the third question, so the middle one about setting direction, that's your vision and strategy or tactics.
Yeah, where are we going?
Right, the where are we going?
Yeah.
And then the third one is how I treat you. That shows whether you're seen. And a big piece of this is including people when you're making decisions that are going to have an effect on them, especially if you think it may have a negative effect. Something to deal with pay or working conditions or hours. Those things are really important to, get some input on, discuss with people before you make those decisions.
So those three questions I think are really interesting. Who are you? Where are we going? And do you see me? If you were to rank those questions in order of importance, how would you rank them?
Oh, you put me on the spot here. I think for me, who you are is critically important. I care deeply about character and integrity, values that the leader has. That said, as I've talked about my work, I find many people resonate most strongly with "Do you see me?" Because that brings it home to me. Do you see me? So some people will say, well, I don't really care so much about who you are. As long as you see me and you're taking care of me, I'm good with that.
So you have one of the 6 keys to leader humility that you've talked about before is this idea of generous inclusion. Is that
Yes.
what you're getting at there with "Do you see me"?
That's one part of it, is the generous inclusion. And today there's a lot of use of that term inclusion in the diversity context, diversity, equity, inclusion. But I'm talking about it much more broadly than that. That's a piece of it. But what I really mean is bringing people in, first of all, who are all of the people who are going to be affected by your decision, and bringing in representatives if it's a large group, or all of the people if it's a small enough group. And you don't have to turn the decision over to them, but what you can do is say, this is coming up and here's a decision we're going to have to make. Business is slower and I don't know that I can keep everybody at full employment. We got some options here. We can lay off, we can do some furloughs, some dial backs. I'm going to have to make a decision, but I want your input. So bringing people into that process. I was actually in a meeting where we were told we might have some layoffs, and there were about 80 people in the room. And quickly the buzz started, and one person popped up and said, I don't know about other people, but I'd be willing to take a furlough, cut my pay back by 20% if anyone else wants to come along with that idea, so we don't have to lay anyone off. And within 5 minutes, all 80 people were volunteering to have their pay cut in order to avoid layoffs. So that's the kind of thing where a leader, by getting people involved who are going to be impacted, can get their engagement, get their full support behind the need.
Why do you think well-intentioned leaders don't include their employees in the way that you've just described?
I think the dominant model of leadership emphasizes strength. And so a lot of people think, well, I'm the leader, I'm supposed to know what's best, I'm supposed to have the answers. It's a weakness if I go to people and act like I'm not sure what to do. But I think you can go to people and explain that here's the context and the problem we're facing, and I want your input. I'm going to have to make a decision, but you matter to me. That's not a weakness. And I think that many leaders simply don't even realize that that's a path they could take.
I know you've done a lot of research and study into the impact of humility in leadership. And upon leadership success. Can you give us some more examples from companies that you know of where the leader has demonstrated humility and that's had a significant bottom line impact on the organization?
Sure. So, in the book, I interviewed 12 CEOs of a variety of companies and a couple of nonprofits and government. And I picked big brand companies like Costco because I wanted most people to recognize that this isn't a backwater concept that only works in a small, 2-person organization, although I have seen it in many, many small organizations. So among the companies that I interviewed, or the individuals I interviewed, was Alan Mulally, who is often touted as one of the best leaders in the last 20 years. And I've been told my time frame might be too short on that. It could be longer. But he certainly was named in 2014 as the number 3 leader in the entire world.
And who's this? Say his name again.
Mulally, Mulally. And he is the CEO who took over Ford Motor Company at the height of the Great Recession when Ford was about to go under. They were losing $17 billion the year he came, and they did. They did lose it. So as he says, it was not a forecast error. But he went into that company, and people said, oh, you're probably going to lay off a lot of the people and bring in your own team. And he said, no, I really anticipate very, very few layoffs. What he did, and he did a turnaround of Ford in a very short period of time, which is how he became named as one of the greatest leaders in the world. And he did that without any federal bailout money. He used a system he calls working together management system. And I actually twisted his arm to write a chapter in the book on that, because that system is based in humility. And with that process, he has a set of expected behaviors that begin with people first, love them up. Those are Alan's words. We've got to respect, listen, and trust each other. Everybody is included, and I mean everybody. He managed to get dealers on board. He managed to get the unions on board. And he did this by creating what he called a one Ford plan. We are all in this together. If this company sinks, you, the dealers, sink. You, the union sinks. We are all about the business of saving Ford and turning it around. And he turned this around with 300,000 employees, all the global dealerships, with very, very few layoffs. The few layoffs he had were primarily executive team members who could not get with the program.
Right.
As he said, we're going to drive fear and intimidation out of this. These are the standards I'm holding myself to for how we behave with people, and I expect all my team to act that way too. And there were a couple of people on the team that couldn't make that shift,
right.
And he helped them understand that they would be happier someplace else.
Let me just ask you a quick question here, because I think this is very important for my audience. You have, in his case, he's got unions, he's got manufacturing, he's
Absolutely.
got sales, he's got development. So he's got this complex organization. Many construction company CEOs find themselves in that place of balancing competing interests, all under the tent of one company.
Absolutely.
Can you give me a specific example of how he functioned in that arena of competing interests?
So one of the things he did was, after a period of time of doing his research and coming up with his one Ford plan with other people's input, he began to roll out what he calls a business plan review. So he's all about relentless implementation. And so there would be a weekly meeting. It would be global by, Zoom if you have to, for those people in different time zones. And it was mandatory that every leader of every unit, whether that was a product unit or a skills-based unit, had to be at that meeting, and they were going to go through their part of how they're doing on that one plan. And there was no tolerance for putting people down, for excessive criticism. It took a culture shift to get to the point where people felt safe enough to say, we're in trouble. I'm having to put a hold on this run on the line because we got a noise and we don't know what's causing it, in this vehicle. And when that finally started to happen, Alan applauded the guy who stood up. It was Mark Fields who stood up to acknowledge that. And he said, great, you have finally helped us see where some of the issues are. Anybody here can help Mark? And he finally got a couple of volunteers, and they said, okay, we're going to staff that on the side next. And once he began to get that breakthrough in the culture where people were trusting enough to tell him where the problems were, tell each other where the problems were, it shifted, and people started to work together because they realized we're all working for this one Ford concept.
That goes back to your 3 ideas of who are you, where are we going, and do you see me, and how people will judge you by what you say and what you do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in that moment when the one person was standing up and saying, I need help, that was Alan's opportunity, not just to speak, but to show in his behavior that he had the idea of support in the midst of the challenges they were going through.
Absolutely. He saw that individual as somebody trying to do a job well, who had a real human need for help. And he responded very supportively. He got the help. He could have a different CEO, a different leader, might have squashed that guy, right? Might have said, well, what's your problem? I mean, we need this. It's got to happen now. What do you mean? You better fix it.
Right.
And that, that lack of humility in a moment like that says to everybody listening, boy, I better not bring my problems forward. I know what's going to happen to me.
You know what? It's funny when you were talking about Alan there and how he changed the culture of the company. It's fascinating when you think about how large that company actually is and how one individual can have such a tremendous positive impact just by making some simple leadership behavioral decisions that made a real difference.
Absolutely. And he's done that twice. He evolved that system. He was with Boeing for many years, and he was CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes before he left to go to Ford. And he had evolved that system at Boeing and had very, very similar results there. And he simply adapted it when he went to Ford. The press, when he went to Ford, said, "What do you know about cars?" It's like, it's not about knowing cars so much. It's knowing how to run an operation, how to lead.
Many of us, when we're hearing this idea of humility, it resonates with us. We say, yeah, I want that. But then, frankly, we're not that humble. We have an ego. Maybe we lose control easily. We get angry. Perhaps we have leveraged our power inappropriately with people and damaged relationships over the years. How could you rebuild yourself in more of a humble model that has this tremendous positive impact?
So I think first of all, there are two things that are essential before we can build it. One is you have to have a reasonable amount of self-awareness. You have to have at least some sense that what you're feeling internally about how great you are may not be totally matched by what other people are seeing and feeling. But if you've got reasonable self-awareness, and the second thing is a will to improve, a desire to improve, then it's really not that hard. Part of the beauty in the book is that there are a set of behaviors, and I'm fairly explicit about them. There's ideas for action, there's do's and don'ts, and you can simply pick these things up. And as you start to improve in one area, you see benefits in your organization, and it gives you the motivation to keep going.
How do I begin to get self-awareness then? Because we think we're self-aware. I know all about me. I mean, I've been on the planet for 50 years and I know me. But so how do we begin to get this self-awareness?
Good question. I'd say that one way of doing it is to stop talking and start listening, to ask people to give you feedback, to ask, how did I do? Can you give me a suggestion, even one suggestion for something I could improve on or I could do better? So asking, debriefing with people after a meeting or after a job and asking for their input will start. If you don't squash the ideas they come up with and
right.
You don't get defensive if they criticize you, then you'll start to realize some of the things that you could improve on.
Let's go back to your book real quick. What are some of the tools that you give people in the book? You could just mention a couple if you could, that helps you to get kind of a handle on yourself and where you might be.
In terms of the self-awareness tools specifically, or building humility?
Building humility, yeah. Let's say I'm aware that, I'm a bit of a prick, and so if you'll forgive me, that's, that's how construction people talk. And, I know that I have an overbearing impact on people. What can I do to start to turn that ship around?
So a couple of things. I mentioned the inclusion piece. Ask your crew. They're on the front line. They often have information that's really important. How's the customer interacting? How's the job going? Where's the problem? Ask them. Include them in your information gathering and your planning. Another one, and this is maybe a little trickier in a construction context, but you need to monitor jokes at other people's expense. Yes. They're really not funny.
Yes.
And it might be that some of the folks think they're having fun, we're just kidding around, but depending on whose expense it is, if there's someone else in that environment who's the butt of those jokes, you're tearing that person's dignity down. They may not say anything back, but it's not helpful. So, and you as a leader are responsible for that. You're responsible for the climate. And so it takes discouraging that kind of behavior. Don't do it yourself, and don't encourage it, and try to minimize that. But that's another way of doing it.
Can I explore that with you real quick?
Sure.
Okay, so because I'm thinking about the folks who are listening, the atmosphere in many construction companies, it can be a little coarse at times.
Yeah.
There's definitely that joking going on. And there's times when it's just healthy joking and we're all friends together and we're doing, and it's healthy. And there's times it goes over the edge. Correct. So how can you, as a leader, maintain that sense of camaraderie, which does have that humor aspect to it, especially in sort of pressures, while still maintaining the dignity and the worth of the people that you're leading. How do you walk that line?
And I have seen a great construction boss do it. And part of it is his own awareness and his own values for respecting others' dignity. That's how he treats people.
Right.
And he is so well liked and respected by his crew that leaders have a big influence on folks. They model things for us.
Yeah.
And so his crew has kind of come in line that way too. And if he hears that coarseness kind of go over the edge where we're not just having, a good Friday afternoon ribbon PJ because he left that pipe in there and that,
Yep.
wall, we're kind of crossing the line where it's getting more personal and it's violating his dignity. In this case, the guy's name is Scott. And in this case, he has just kind of made it clear we don't tear other people down.
Let's say someone has had a situation where they've screwed up. They showed up in a way as a leader that was contrary to either what they've stated they want to do or how they think they should. What can a leader do to recover from that?
Depending on how strong that leader is, and this is a different definition of strength, the leader can go to the people who were affected by that and say, I screwed up. Or, I've been thinking about that and I really feel that wasn't the best way to do that. And I'd like to go at it differently going forward. I'm going to try. Appreciate your help. Give me some feedback if I'm not getting there.
Okay.
Be vulnerable. Just own it. That doesn't make you weak. It actually enhances you in people's eyes.
You know how it is in relationships? They get so messy sometimes, and you're sitting there thinking about it and you're saying, man, this relationship I've had with someone on my team, it just hasn't been great, but it's been that way for years. How do you begin to repair a relationship that's deeply damaged?
That's a good question. And I'm not a therapist, but what I would recommend is to not try to pull in everything that's happened over the years, but to simply start with where you are today. And if today it's realizing I want to show up differently. I think I've done some things that have contributed to this problem. Then I'd simply be here now. This is what I want to do going forward. And I might make a fairly brief reference to that. I mean, one way is you could sit down and say, okay, Eric, let's go grab a beer and sit down and talk about the last 10 years of problems we've had.
We might need 2 beers for that. We might need 2 beers.
You might need 2 or 10. Another way is to say, I've been doing some reflecting and in the future, Eric, I'm going to try to do this differently. I just think it'd be healthier for both of our working relationship if I could do this and, let me know how I'm doing on that. And, you might invite them to respond. What do you think about that? Or you might not. You might just say, this is what I'm going to do. Let me know how it's going. But it's an improvement. They're going to know it's an improvement. And they're going to appreciate it.
One thing you said there, which really struck with me, was this idea of begin where you are now.
Right.
Because I think sometimes, because there's so much baggage, it's just so overwhelming. So people think, well, why even bother having the conversation to start with? But just to begin where you are now with some simple commitments or a simple acknowledgement of, perhaps a change of behavior, that can be kind of releasing for the person who wants to rebuild that relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A tiny change opens the door. And if that works and it leads to some progress, then you make another tiny change, several weeks from now. Yeah, just let it evolve.
Excellent. That's really great. I really appreciate your time here, Marilyn. As we're closing up here, if there's 3 things that I can do to show up as this humble leader, what are 3 things that I can do right away?
So these are my top 3, and someone might get a different set from reading the book, but integrity, I told you character matters to me. Your integrity, do you tell the truth? Do you follow through on commitments? Can I trust you? So that, if you say something, I know that's your word is good. That's a big one. And I think it's big for lots of people. Inclusion. Do you ask my input before you make big decisions that are going to affect me in my work with you? That's another one that's really important. And I would just say to leaders, think of all the people that are affected by what you're doing. Your customers, your employees, you've got permits and licenses and maybe oversight. People are going to have to come out and look at jobs. All sorts of things go into that. draw the boundary so that all of them are included when you're thinking of making a big decision, and make sure that you check in with all of these different groups so that they feel that their dignity's been supported too. And then the third one would be, kind of going back to the do you see me? No jokes at other expenses.
Very good.
At others' expense. It's not funny. It might be funny to you or to the group that's laughing about it, but if it's at the expense of someone else, if it's putting them down, it's not funny to them.
That's excellent. Marilyn, your book is The Extraordinary Power of Leader Humility, and it's on sale now. We're going to put links in the show notes so that people can get hold of that book. How else can we get hold of you if we'd like to do that, Marilyn?
You can jump on my website. I'd love to have everybody sign up as a member of the community so you can get news and inspiration.
Beautiful. Yeah. And we will have links in the show notes, both to your book and to your website. I'd just like to ask you a question. I know you're up in Seattle. This is a final question I like to ask my guests. I have clients up in Seattle. So if I'm going to jump on a plane and go visit them, what restaurant are you going to recommend that I insist that they take me out to?
Oh. Well, given that we have some things still closed, one of them that's open, it's a bit on the pricey side, but since they're going to take you out, I would say Carmine's.
Carmine's.
Carmine's, Carmines.
Well, if it's on the pricey side, then I'll be happy to pay for it.
Yeah, it's worth it. It's worth it.
Awesome. Carmine's. What kind of food is there at Carmine's?
It's kind of a mix of Italian with some seafood. They also have steaks and whatnot, but I'd say Italian is the slant.
And what do you order when you go to Carmine's?
Oh, every time I go, I get something different, and I've never been disappointed.
That's beautiful. Excellent. Well, Marilyn, I appreciate your generosity today. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Construction Genius. Hope you found that 1% of inspiration to help you in the next few days. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star review on iTunes, share it with other construction leaders who you think would benefit, and always remember that the show is brought to you by Kick-Ass Meetings. I've been working with construction leaders since 2004, teaching them how to run extremely effective problem-solving meetings that gets their people collaborating, taps into their creativity, and to get yourself a free copy of the Kick-Ass Meeting Report, go to www.ericanderton.com/kickassmeetings. Grab yourself that free report, read it, use it in your business. You'll find it extremely useful. And thanks again for listening.